The private hangar was a cathedral of cold steel, drenched in the heavy silence of failure. A private jet worth $100 million sat paralyzed, a grounded giant defeated by an invisible ghost. The elite engineers had retreated, their pride shattered. Evelyn Cross, the billionaire CEO, stood alone by the air stairs, her silhouette sharp against the dim lights. Her schedule was ruined. A multi-billion-dollar merger was collapsing. In the shadows, a single dad mechanic was packing his worn tools. No one asked for his help. No one expected a miracle from a man in grease-stained rags. He stepped forward. "May I listen?" Then she whispered something that froze the room. Jack Nolan was 44 years old, but the deep lines etched around his eyes suggested a man who had lived twice that. He was a contract mechanic at the private airport, a man who existed in the periphery of wealth without ever touching it. Every day he clocked in, fixed what was broken, and clocked out to be home for his 9-year-old daughter, Sophie. She was his entire world, the North Star in a sky that had gone dark years ago. Since his wife, Maria, passed away in a tragic industrial accident at a construction site, a victim of the very corporate negligence Jack once fought against, he had rebuilt his life from the wreckage, piece by painful, lonely piece. But Jack wasn't always a ghost in the hangar. A decade ago, he had been the rising star of aerospace engineering, a man whose name was whispered with reverence in the corridors of NASA and Boeing. He was a prodigy of propulsion systems, a visionary who could visualize the flow of gases through a turbine as if they were streams of liquid light. His career was on a vertical trajectory until the day he discovered a catastrophic safety flaw in a new commercial turbine project. He had spoken up, expecting a fix. Instead, he found a wall of corporate silence built by men who valued stock prices over human lives. When Jack refused to sign off on the falsified safety data, the industry didn't just fire him, they erased him. His reputation was systematically dismantled. His patents were credited to others, and a quiet, lethal blacklist ensured he would never design a wing or a blade again. He didn't sue. He didn't fight. He looked at his infant daughter and decided that peace was more valuable than a hollow victory in a rigged game. He chose the dignity of manual labor, hiding his brilliant mind behind a permanent layer of oil and the silence of a man who knew too much. On this particular night, Jack wasn't even supposed to be near the main hangar. He had been hired as a temporary hand to clean the auxiliary bays after a massive chemical spill. But as the hours dragged past midnight, he found himself drawn to the center of the facility, lured by the scent of high-grade kerosene and the palpable vibration of anxiety. He watched from the shadows as the best minds in the country, men in pristine white lab coats holding $500,000 diagnostic tablets, plugged their devices into the jet's ports. All they were met with was a mocking array of blinking red lights and cryptic error codes that defied their logic. Evelyn Cross stood nearby, her arms tightly crossed over her chest, her eyes burning with a cold, desperate fire. She was the architect of an empire, a woman who had mastered the art of control in a chaotic world. But in this moment, all her billions couldn't make a single turbine blade rotate. She was watching her future, a merger that would stabilize thousands of jobs and define her legacy, slip away with every ticking second of the countdown to her morning meeting in Zurich. The tension was a living thing, coiling around everyone in the room. Jack stood leaning against his broom, his head tilted slightly to the side. He wasn't looking at the screens or the heat maps. He was listening to the breathing of the machine. The jet's auxiliary power unit was humming, but there was a hitch, a tiny, almost imperceptible stutter in the intake rhythm that occurred every 14 seconds. It was a sound only a man who had spent his life in the soul of machines could hear. To Jack, it didn't sound like a computer error. It sounded like a gasp for air. It sounded like a heartbeat skipping a beat out of fear. The head engineer, a man named Dr. Aris, whose reputation was built on theoretical models and expensive degrees, threw his tablet onto a plastic crate in a fit of rage. "The data is fundamentally illogical," he shouted at the ceiling. "The digital twin says the engine is perfect, but the physical feedback is dead. There is nothing left to check. It's a ghost in the system." Evelyn didn't respond. She simply stared at the floor, the weight of total defeat finally beginning to bow her shoulders. Jack felt the old engineer inside him, the one who loved the truth of metal more than the comfort of a paycheck, begin to stir. He looked at the engine not as a piece of hardware, but as a living creature in distress. He knew the flight window was closing. If he stayed silent, the jet stayed grounded and Evelyn's world would fracture. If he spoke, he risked exposing the man he had worked so hard to bury. He looked at the grease under his fingernails, thought of Sophie's sleeping face, and took a deep, steadying breath. He walked out of the shadows, the heels of his work boots echoing like gunshots on the polished concrete, and crossed the yellow safety line. The silence that greeted Jack's approach was immediate and suffocating. Two security guards, muscles tensed under their black uniforms, immediately stepped into his path. "Back to the auxiliary bay, Nolan," the larger one snapped, his hand hovering over his holster. "This area is restricted to authorized personnel only." Jack didn't stop. He didn't even look at them. He kept his eyes fixed on Evelyn Cross, sensing the desperation radiating off her like heat. Evelyn turned slowly, her movements stiff. Her gaze was like a frozen lake, beautiful, but capable of drowning you in an instant. "What is this?" she asked, her voice a low, dangerous whisper that carried more weight than Eris's shouting. Dr. Eris let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "He's just the maintenance help, Ms. Cross. A janitor who probably thinks he found a loose bolt. Take him out of here." The other engineers joined in, their own feelings of inadequacy venting out as cruel elitist humor. "Hey, buddy, you think you can fix $1 million propulsion system with a mop? Maybe try giving the turbine a nice scrub with some soapy water?" Jack didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge the man in the white coat. He spoke directly to the woman who held the power. "You're staring at a map of a city that doesn't exist anymore," Jack said, his voice surprisingly deep and steady. "Your software is looking for a digital ghost, but the problem is breathing right in front of you. It's physical, it's mechanical. Give me 5 minutes. I don't need a laptop, and I don't need your data. I just need to listen to what the metal is trying to tell you." Evelyn's eyes narrowed into slits. She was a master of reading people, and she saw something in Jack that didn't belong in a blue jumpsuit. She saw the way he stood, his weight evenly distributed, his hands relaxed, his eyes focused with a terrifying level of clarity. This wasn't the posture of a man who spent his life sweeping floors. There was a dormant authority in his voice that bypassed her brain and hit her instincts. She looked at her platinum watch. She had exactly 42 minutes before the flight window vanished. "You have 5 minutes," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the laughter like a blade. The hangar erupted in a chorus of indignant protests. "Ms. Cross, this is a flagrant violation of every safety protocol in the aviation handbook," Eris screamed, his face turning a mottled purple. "If he so much as touches that engine casing, the warranty is voided and the liability is astronomical. He's a nobody. He's a janitor." "Let him," Evelyn said, her tone absolute, a final judgment that brooked no further argument. The security guards stepped back, though their eyes remained wary. The engineers retreated into a huddle of bitter whispers, crossing their arms as they prepared to watch the janitor fail. Jack walked up to the massive yawning intake of the engine. He didn't reach for a manual. He didn't check a single gauge. He did something that made every expert in the room recoil in disgust. He took off his heavy, grease-caked work gloves, closed his eyes, and pressed his bare, calloused ear directly against the cold, composite skin of the engine housing. He stood there for 60 seconds, a statue of flesh against steel. He was doing something no computer could. He was filtering out the white noise of the hangar, the hum of the cooling fans, and the frantic breathing of the people around him. He was searching for the frequency of the failure. He heard it, a faint, rhythmic clicking hidden behind the vibration of the fuel pumps. Click, click, click. Silence. Jack reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small, magnetic ball-peen hammer, an old friend he had carried for 20 years. He moved to 3 specific points on the turbine casing, tapping them with a surgeon's precision. Ting, ting, thud. He leaned in closer, his brow furrowed. The secondary bypass valve isn't stuck, he whispered to the machine. It's suffocating because the pressure logic is lying to the actuator. He stood up and looked at the team of stun specialists. I need a half-inch offset wrench, a torque-limited screwdriver, and a new Viton O-ring from the secondary hydraulic assembly. Now, don't check your tablets, just get the parts. The technicians remained frozen, looking at Dr. Aris, who was staring at Jack as if he were a madman. Don't move an inch, Aris commanded. He's going to cause a catastrophic compressor stall. Evelyn didn't wait for them. She walked over to the primary tool bench, her silk dress rustling against the metal. She scanned the wall, her eyes sharp. She found a heavy silver wrench and walked it over to Jack herself, handing it to him with a steady hand. The message was unmistakable. The old world of titles was over. Only the man with the wrench mattered now. Jack began to work. His hands, which usually looked clumsy holding a broom, transformed. They moved with a fluidity and grace that silenced even the most cynical engineer in the room. He unscrewed a tiny, obscure access panel located beneath the fuel rail. A panel the engineers hadn't touched because the diagnostic software reported it as functioning within normal parameters. Inside, buried behind a complex loom of wiring, was a tiny, distorted seal. Look at this, Jack said, holding up a small, pinched piece of rubber that had been improperly seated during the last maintenance cycle. It was so insignificant, it looked like a piece of trash. At high pressure, this creates a microscopic vacuum leak. Your sensors interpret that as a drop in fuel density, and the computer kills the ignition to prevent a fire that isn't actually happening. You've been trying to perform open-heart surgery when the patient just had a pebble in his shoe. The air in the hangar was so still, it felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out. Jack carefully replaced the seal, his movements methodical, almost ritualistic. He adjusted the fuel valve angle by exactly 0.5 degrees, a tiny manual correction that relied entirely on the feel of the wrench against the threads. It was a correction born from decades of intimate conversation with metal, something no digital sensor could ever replicate. Close the housing, Jack commanded, his voice echoing in the silence. The technicians, now moving like puppets under Evelyn's watchful gaze, secured the panels with trembling fingers. Jack stepped back, wiping his hands on a grimy rag, his face showing the immense strain of the last few minutes. Clear the deck, he said quietly. Start the ignition sequence. But don't use the auto start. Do it manually, step by step. Dr. Aris scoffed, though his confidence was visibly leaking away. He walked to the control terminal, his hands shaking as he touched the screen. When the turbine blades shatter and the hangar fills with shrapnel, I want it on the black box that I protested this madness. He took a breath and engaged the starter motors. The hangar was suddenly filled with a low-frequency whine as the massive starter motors began to groan. In every previous attempt, this was where the engine would cough, sputter, and die with a pathetic mechanical rattle. But this time the sound was different. It was a smooth, rising crescendo that vibrated in the very bones of the observers. The turbine caught. A deep, resonant roar exploded into the space, a sound so pure, so perfectly balanced, that it made the water in the fire buckets ripple in perfect concentric circles. It wasn't just running. The engine was singing a song of raw, unadulterated power. The digital displays on the walls, which had been a chaotic sea of red warnings for 6 hours, suddenly snapped into a solid, brilliant emerald green. Impossible, someone whispered in the back. The pressure ratios, they're flatter than the test bench models. It's perfect. The engine reached full idle thrust. The roar settled into a steady, confident hum that sounded like $100 million of engineering finally finding its purpose. The engineers stood paralyzed, staring at their screens as if they were seeing a miracle. Jack didn't celebrate. He didn't look at Aris for an apology. He simply walked back to his worn leather tool bag and began carefully cleaning his wrench. Evelyn Cross didn't move for a long time. She stood staring at the jet, the flickering lights of the engine's status indicators reflecting in her eyes like stars. She then turned and walked toward Jack. Her assistants and the security detail tried to follow, but she held up a sharp hand, stopping them in their tracks. She wanted to be alone with the man who had just saved her legacy. She stopped inches from him, The hangar was still buzzing with the powerful life force of the machine, but between the two of them, there was a private pocket of absolute silence. Jack looked up, his face lined with the exhaustion of a man who had carried the weight of the world for 5 minutes. He expected a check, a NDAs to sign, or perhaps a polite thank you before being escorted out the back door. Instead, Evelyn leaned in. She got so close that Jack could smell the expensive, subtle perfume and the faint bitterness of cold espresso on her breath. She leaned toward his ear and whispered, a sound so quiet it was barely a vibration of air. I knew they were wrong, she whispered, her voice trembling with a rare hidden emotion. I was just afraid to listen, because if they were wrong, it meant I was the only one in this room who was actually sane. Thank you for showing me I wasn't alone. Jack froze. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the devastating vulnerability behind them. This woman who commanded a global empire had just admitted her deepest fear to a man she had treated as invisible for weeks. She wasn't just talking about the engine. She was talking about the crushing isolation of power. She was talking about a world where everyone lied to her to stay in her favor, and no one had the courage to tell her the truth. Evelyn pulled back. Her face was once again a mask of unyielding stone. She didn't blink. She didn't smile. She turned on her heel and walked toward the air stairs with the stride of a conqueror. Prepare for departure, she barked at the ground crew, her voice once again the authority of a billionaire. We leave in 10 minutes. I have a merger to sign. Apparem. The hangar exploded into a frenzy of activity. People were running, shouting, finalizing flight plans. Jack stood there, the greasy rag still clutched in his hand, watching the woman disappear into the luxurious cabin of the jet. The experts avoided his gaze as they scurried past, their faces red with shame. He was the man who had proven them all to be frauds, but he was also the man who had seen the queen without her crown. 24 hours later, the world was a different place. The morning news was flooded with triumphant reports of the Cross-Zurich merger, a historic deal that had been signed against all odds. Evelyn Cross was being hailed as a visionary, a woman who never let a minor technical delay stop her from reshaping the global economy. Jack was back in his small, cramped apartment, the smell of grease replaced by the scent of maple syrup as he made pancakes for Sophie. The black oil was gone from under his fingernails, but the memory of the hangar was still fresh, an electric hum in his mind. He was wondering if he would even have a job when he went back, whether they would fire him for knowing too much, when a sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulled up to the curb. A man in a sharp charcoal suit walked to his door and handed him a heavy cream-colored envelope. Inside was a contract that felt like it was made of money. Evelyn wasn't just offering him a job. She was offering him the position of Chief of Global Aviation Maintenance and Safety. The salary was more money than Jack could spend in 3 lifetimes. It came with a penthouse overlooking the city, a private school for Sophie, and a permanent seat at the table during every major board meeting. It was a ticket back into the world he had been exiled from. Jack read the contract twice, his hands slightly trembling. He looked at Sophie, who was humming a little song while she colored in a picture of a rocket ship. He thought about the years of being a nobody, of the cold nights and the unpaid bills. He thought about the power he could have to change things from the inside. Then he looked at the final page. There was a handwritten note from Evelyn in elegant, sharp script. The truth is a very lonely place, Jack. Come help me bear it. Jack sat down at his small kitchen table, the sun streaming through the window. He picked up a pen. He thought about Dr. Eris and the men in the white coats. He thought about the corporate culture that had erased him once before. He realized that if he took this job, he would become one of them. He would be surrounded by data and politics, and eventually the noise of the boardroom would drown out the breath of the machines. He would lose the very thing that made him a father, and the very thing that made him whole. He wrote a short, firm letter back. Dear Ms. Cross, you don't need a chief of maintenance. You need to change the way you hear the world. I am a father first and a mechanic second. I like the sound of my daughter's laughter more than the sound of a private jet, but I have a condition for my refusal. Jack didn't ask for a penny. He didn't ask for a title. He asked for the company to release the sealed records of the turbine failure from 10 years ago. He asked for the names of the engineers who were blacklisted to be cleared. And he asked for a new company-wide policy. Any worker, from the janitor to the pilot, could stop a flight if they heard something wrong, and they would be rewarded for their honesty with a month's bonus, not punished with a pink slip. Evelyn Cross didn't call him. She didn't send another SUV. 2 days later, the Cross Aerospace Integrity Act was announced to the world press. The company admitted to historical errors in safety reporting and cleared the names of a dozen engineers, including Jack Nolan. The head engineer from the hangar, Dr. Aris, was quietly reassigned to a desk job in a remote regional office. Jack went back to the airport. He wasn't the chief of anything. He was still a mechanic, but his title on the payroll had changed. He was now the senior technical auditor. He worked when he wanted, on the projects he chose. He still wore his old, comfortable blue jumpsuit. And most importantly, he was home every single day at 3 p.m. to walk Sophie home from the bus stop. Weeks turned into months and life settled into a new, more honest rhythm. Jack was no longer the janitor. When he walked through the main hangar now, the younger mechanics, the ones who hadn't forgotten the lesson of that night, looked at him with a mixture of awe and profound respect. They didn't see a guy who swept floors. They saw a man who had looked a billionaire in the eye and told her the truth when the whole world was lying. One afternoon, Jack was teaching a young apprentice how to check the tension on a landing gear assembly. "Don't just look at the torque wrench digital display," Jack said, his voice patient and warm. "Feel the metal through the handle. If it's resisting you, if it feels tight in the wrong way, there's a reason. Machines don't have the capacity to lie, but they are very good at hiding the truth from those who don't care to listen." The young man nodded, his eyes wide with a new kind of curiosity. "Is it true, Jack, what they say in the break room? That you fixed a billionaire's jet with a $3 rubber seal and a tiny hammer?" Jack laughed softly, a sound of genuine peace. "I didn't fix it with a hammer, kid. I fixed it by paying attention when everyone else was too busy proving how smart they were. I was just trying to be helpful." High above them, a silver streak cut across the vast blue sky, its engines leaving a perfect white trail of vapor. Jack didn't need to check the flight schedule or see the tail number to know it was her. He could hear it. Even from 30,000 feet below, he could recognize the perfect harmonic hum of that specific turbine. It was running perfectly, a testament to a truth that was no longer hidden. Evelyn Cross never spoke to him again in person. She didn't need to. Every time her jet landed for a scheduled inspection, a small, handwritten report was left in Jack's locker. It detailed the subtle sounds the pilots had noticed during the flight, the tiny rattles, the shifts in pitch. It was their private language, a bridge between two very different worlds, built on the shared understanding that the truth is the most valuable currency there is. On the main wall of the hangar, right above the entrance to the engineering offices, a new sign had been installed. It wasn't made of cheap plastic, it was engraved in solid brass. It didn't mention profit margins or quarterly targets. It simply said, "If you hear something wrong, speak." Jack walked home that evening as the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the tarmac. Sophie was waiting for him at the gate, clutching a toy airplane they had been building together in their small workshop. "Did you save the sky today, Daddy?" she asked, her eyes bright with the innocent belief that her father was a giant among men. Jack picked her up, breathing in the scent of her hair, and kissed her forehead. "No, Sophie, I just listened to it. And sometimes in a world this noisy, that's enough." He realized then that the billionaire's whisper wasn't just a secret about a machine. It was a secret about what it means to be a human being. We are all terrified of being the only ones who see the cracks in the foundation. We are all afraid that if we speak our truth, the world will stop, stare, and then move on without us. But once you find the courage to listen, truly listen, to your own heart and the rhythm of the world around you, you realize you were never truly alone in the first place. The jet disappeared into the distant clouds, heading for another country, another deal, another high-stakes world. But down on the ground in a small house with a garden and the sound of a child's laughter, the man with the greased hands was exactly where he was meant to be. There are some victories that don't require a podium or a trophy. There are some heroes who don't need a cape or a title. And there are some whispers that are loud enough to change the entire sky forever. If this story moved your soul and reminded you that integrity is the most powerful tool you will ever own, then you are a part of this family. At Daddy Healing Stories, we believe that the quietest voices often hold the most profound truths. Don't forget to subscribe and follow our journey as we celebrate the fathers, the workers, and the unsung heroes who keep the world turning. We'll see you in the next story.